Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar presented by the CAGP Foundation. My name is Ruth McKenzie, and I'm the President and CEO of CAGP and Executive Director of the CAGP Foundation. We are so pleased to offer a couple of free webinars every year so that we can share information on issues and topics that are relevant for CAGP members and beyond. And this one is no exception. Brad Offman from Spire Philanthropy joins us today to present everything you've ever wanted to know about endowments. But first, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement, and in doing so to recognize the many territories of Turtle Island, otherwise known as Canada, on which we live, work, and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a more just future together. For those interested in identifying the territory on which you reside or are gathering locally, please visit www.native-land.ca. Thank you, Miigwech. Before today's webinar begins, I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. First, we'd like to ask that you please keep your videos and mics off throughout the webinar. We are happy to offer real-time transcription during the webinar. In order to enable or disable this function, simply click on the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We welcome you to engage with each other using the chat function throughout today's presentation. If you have questions for our presenter, please also post them in the chat function. We welcome your questions and we'll make sure we find time to answer as many as we can towards the end of the session. You will note that in the login email that Erin sent out to you, there is also a link to a Dropbox folder. In that folder, you will find CFRE and MFA-P CE tracker sheets for today's webinar, Brad Offman's bio, and a PDF of today's presentation. This webinar is worth 1 CFRE credit and 1 MFA-P credit. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording within the next 24 hours. Before we get started, we are so pleased to have Pear Tree Canada as a sponsor for our 2022-23 Webinar Wednesday series. And I'd like to turn it over to Pear Tree now for a few words from them as our sponsor.
Hello from beautiful Whistler, British Columbia. My name is Michael Fugman, and on behalf of Pear Tree Canada, as a proud ongoing CAGP sponsor, we welcome you to the 2022-2023 webinar series. Pear Tree Canada was founded over 15 years ago, offering a unique and strategic approach to lowering the after-tax cost of annual major gift fundraising using our flow-through donation platform. Over the coming months, you will hear from my colleagues across Canada welcome you to each webinar. Pear Tree has a Canada-wide presence, which means we likely know you, charity or advisor, and the intricacies of your audience and how our offer can be maximized in each province. I encourage you to visit peartreecanada.com and see our team to meet our coast-to-coast representation. Our proven platform is widely accepted by Canadian philanthropists and their wealth, tax, and legal advisors, even in the most complicated multi-generational and multi-jurisdictional family and corporate scenarios. From grassroots organizations to the largest institutions, Pear Tree helps major gift donors give more, resulting in transformational giving while simultaneously funding job creation in Canada's northern and remote communities. As mentioned earlier, please visit peartreecanada.com to learn more. And now, enjoy the webinar.
Once again, thank you to Pear Tree Canada for their support. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter. Brad Offman is founder and managing partner of Spire Philanthropy, a management consultancy firm specializing in corporate charitable partnerships. Spire Philanthropy partners with CAGP and Knowledge Bureau offering the MFA-P, Master Financial Advisor in Philanthropy certification program. Brad is a member of the CAGP Government Relations Committee and also sits on the CAGP Foundation Board of Directors. Brad, thanks so much for being here with us today, and I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, and thanks everybody for joining. It looks like we have quite a few participants on today's call, which is great. We're going to talk about a topic that is certainly near and dear to me. My job here today is to end a lot of the confusion around endowments. In doing so, I'm probably going to start by adding a little bit of confusion to the situation, but hopefully by the end, we're going to get to a situation where we kind of all understand and we're all on the same page when it comes to endowments. So lots of questions about endowments. It's one of those words that people throw around a lot, and we're going to get to the bottom of what the word endowment actually means. So we're actually going to start by looking at some donors, a couple of donors, and I'm going to pose a question to the group. So our first donor today is Judy Sarazin. Judy has donated $1 million to the Ontario Symphony Orchestra Foundation. That charity is going to come up a lot in our presentation today. It's obviously not a real charity. Judy and the foundation agree that they are going to invest her gift. The capital of that gift is going to be held permanently. And each year, the income from her gift of $1 million will be used to support the purchasing of new instruments for the members of the orchestra. There is no end date. My question to you is, has Judy created an endowment? And we're going to have a little poll, a very simple yes or no answer. There's no maybe here. We want everybody to answer yes or no, whether you agree, has Judy created an endowment? We'll just take a minute while your responses are tallied. Okay. Okay. The results are in. 80 of the vast majority of you, the overwhelming majority of you believe that Judy has in fact created an endowment. Over 80% of you, and 18% of you say no, she hasn't in fact created an endowment. So let's move on. We're going to go to another donor, and we're going to present a different scenario. Sarah Judson. She has also donated $1 million to the same charity, the Symphony Orchestra Foundation. However, her gift is going to be structured a little bit differently. In the first year, $200,000 of her donation will be used to make the stage accessible. Then over the next 8 years, the remaining $800,000 of her gift will be used to support programming for young artists. After 10 years, the gift is fully spent. Has Sarah created an endowment? Same question, same response, yes or no. Has Sarah created an endowment? Give you a minute to respond. Okay, very different results here. Only 34%, it's about 1/3, 2/3 split here. So about 1/3 of you do think that Sarah has created an endowment, but 2/3 of you don't. So very different response. We had the same amount of the donation. The gift was structured differently, but in the case of Sarah, most of you don't think she's created an endowment. Our job today is to try and answer that question. And actually to say, does that question even matter? So here is the fundamental problem with endowments in Canada. There is no legal or formal definition for endowment. If you read the Income Tax Act, you will not find the word endowment anywhere in the entire act. By the way, there's an accounting definition, but we're not going to get into that today. But there's no legal definition. In the fundraising context, there's no legal definition. And because there's no definition for the word, that invariably leads to a lot of confusion. History is really, really important here. I'm actually a historian by training, and history is always important to me, but it's especially important to understanding the current context of endowments, because you see a lot of terms thrown out there like spend down endowment and fixed term endowment, and that's really just overcomplicated things when people start attaching these phrases to the word endowments. So everybody's confused. Fundraisers are confused. And if we're confused as fundraisers, I can assure you that your donors are also confused. There is a tremendous, I can't think of an issue in the fundraising arena which probably generates more confusion than endowments. Everybody's confused. So let's look at the history a bit. History is really important here. So prior to 2010, the disbursement rules for charities really put donors into two camps. So if you wanted to support a charity, you basically had the choice of being either an immediate donor or a long-term donor, either or. If you were an immediate donor, your gift was used immediately to support the organization's current or immediate needs. Or you were a long-term donor, where the gift would be placed typically in a permanent fund where the income from that gift would be used to support the organization's long-term needs. So that's really important. You were either an immediate donor or you were a long-term donor. There wasn't a lot of room to be anything in between. Again, this is prior to 2010. So this is where we got this notion of a long-term traditional endowment. And this is, again, how many folks continue to describe the word today. A donor would make a restricted gift to the charity where the funds would often be held in perpetuity, in other words, forever. The income from those funds would be used each year to support charitable activities and programs. The donor and charity would typically enter into a formal agreement, and the charity would report, usually annually, to the donor or the donor's family. This was the traditional notion of endowment. So when many people are talking about endowments, they talk about endowments in these terms. And if we go back to our two donors at the beginning of the presentation, the first donor, whose name was Judith, would fall into this category. And remember, over 80% of you felt that Judith had made a traditional endowed gift. Again, where the gift would be held permanently and the income would be used each year to support charitable activities and programs. That's where the traditional terminology around endowments comes from. So for a long time, and for those of you who were working in the 20th century, which I can't believe was 20 years ago, these traditional long-term endowments were very popular. And again, many, if not most fundraisers are still using this traditional definition today when they're talking about endowments. Remembering, of course, as you know, that the word endowment actually doesn't have a definition. So you would have a situation where the capital, again, I'm going to repeat this, the capital would be held intact in perpetuity or for a very long period of time, and the income derived from that capital, from that invested capital, would be used to support the charitable programs, and often it would be the donor who would tell the charity exactly what programs they wanted to support through their gift. This is very much the traditional endowment. To complicate things even further, sometimes a charity's board of directors would actually direct funds into what they called an endowment fund. The charity would often direct all undesignated planned or bequest gifts, and as you know, many of the bequest gifts that your charity received are not planned. So a charity might get a very large gift, and because they didn't want to use all of that money right away, they would put it in what would be called a board-directed endowment. In fact, many charities built up their endowment funds as a result of undesignated planned and bequest gifts that were designated to a board-directed endowment. Again, this is a little bit of a tangent, but you have to know that this was actually very popular. It's less popular now. So these older restrictive rules that I'm talking about, where you again had to be either an immediate or a long-term donor, those rules were repealed in 2010. And I think the changes resulting from those rules being repealed are still only slowly permeating the donor and the fundraising communities. So let's really do a really good job of synthesizing the rules. Again, under the old rules, 2010 and earlier, as a donor, you either had to support the immediate or the long-term objectives of the charity. And under the newer rules, because the rules weren't so much changed as repealed, and under the new rules, anything goes. And we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about what I mean when I say anything goes. So again, older rules, they had to be on either an immediate or long-term. Under the new rules, pretty much anything goes. And this is all coming back, by the way, we're going to the whole notion and concept of endowments. So we're going to work through our understanding of endowments and the rules in the context of actually looking at a donor. Our donor, we have a new donor. We have the same charity that we've been talking about for a while. And our donor today is Mary Ellen Marcos. The charity, once again, is the Ontario Symphony Orchestra Foundation. So who's Mary Ellen? Well, she's the former board chair of the OSO. In other words, she's very, very highly committed to the organization. She knows it very well. She's a tech entrepreneur, very high net worth. She just sold her latest company, and this is important. As a result of the sale, she's left with a huge tax bill, which is very common when you sell a company, resulting from the capital gains associated with that company. So she's got a huge tax bill coming up. And she knows that charitable giving is probably the easiest and most efficient way to eliminate or mitigate a tax bill. She's married to her partner, Georgina. She's got one teenage daughter. She's got a fairly strong giving history to the Ontario Symphony Orchestra. She's made a large campaign gift in the past. She's made also some very large sporadic annual gifts. So she's a pretty committed donor. As a donor, she is very interested in supporting young musicians from marginalized, underserved communities. Okay, so this is Mary Ellen, and this is her relationship to a charity that she loves dearly. So Mary Ellen doesn't find this notion of a permanent endowment appealing. She doesn't want to give the money and have it stashed away and only the income from that donation used to support programming. Her goal is she wants to start up a new after-school program to attract young musicians from underserved communities. She wants that money to be put to work right away because that program needs funding to get it off the ground. When you start a new program, and I'm sure all of you have worked for organizations that have started new programs, there's a lot of upfront money that's required. Importantly, the Ontario Symphony Orchestra also wants to start this program. So there's a lot of alignment in terms of what the donor wants to do and what the charity wants to do. There's a lot of alignment there. She wants to get this new program up and running, so too does the OSO. So let's look at some of the key issues here. Well, we need to know what are the program's funding requirements to get it off the ground. We need to know how much money we need. Is there common ground between the donor and the charity? In other words, does the charity want to do what the donor wants to do? You may have donors come to you all the time and say, I want to do this. And sometimes the charity will actually start up a program that they don't necessarily want to, just because they have a really interested and committed donor. But in this case, there's actually common ground between the donor and the charity. What are the other sources of funding? These things take a lot of money to get off the ground. Are there going to be other sources of funding? And how does Mary Ellen's tax situation factor into this? Remember, I told you a couple of slides ago that Mary Ellen had recently sold a company, resulting in a fairly significant capital gains tax bill. Well, we throw around the term a lot in fundraising, a lot, this notion of donor-centered fundraising. And I'm not really a seasoned fundraiser, but to me that means listening to our donor. Like what does the donor actually want to do? So in this case, Mary Ellen, she wants to get the program up and running. She does not want to fund it forever. She wants to provide the upfront funding. She's going to be interested in other programs in the future. So if we're listening to our donor as we structure and we think about a gift, from that donor, we want to be able to structure a gift that reflects what the donor is trying to do. Okay, and here are the funding requirements for the program. So like all new programs, there are going to be some capital costs to start the program. They've determined those are going to be around $700,000. The actual operating cost will be $500,000 in year one, $600,000 in year two, and $700,000 in years 3 to 10. The numbers don't really matter, but you know, like with new programs, there are very significant costs to get them up off the ground. So how should Mary Ellen and the Ontario Symphony Orchestra structure the gift? Well, she's agreed to fund 50% of the program startup costs in the first 10 years. Very generous. We know from the numbers that I provided, those total costs will be around $7,400,000. Her share will be half of that, or $3,700,000. She's going to donate the entire amount in 2022. Why is she going to donate the entire amount in 2022? Well, she needs to mitigate the tax problem resulting from the sale of her company. Remember, she has a big tax bill. And the way she's going to mitigate a big chunk of that tax bill is through this charitable donation that she needs to make in this calendar year in order to mitigate that tax problem. So she's going to donate the full whack of money, $3.7 million in this calendar year. So here's the question. Has Mary Ellen created an endowment? Well, here's some things that we know. We know it's not permanent. She structured it so it's going to be used over about a 10-year period. It's also not immediate. It's not going to be used all in the first year. It's going to be used over 10 years. I would describe that as being medium term. Medium not being a technical term, but it's neither it nor is it a long-term or permanent gift. So is this an endowment? And here's the answer. And this really, I think, boils down to our fundamental understanding of endowments and how gifts are structured. The answer is, I don't know if this is an endowment. When we go back to our first two donors, Sarah and Judith, I don't know if Judith created an endowment. I don't know if Sarah created an endowment. I don't know if Mary Ellen created an endowment. And the truth is, I don't care. And I would argue as fundraisers, we also shouldn't care. Because the donor is thrilled. Mary Ellen is thrilled. The charity, the symphony is delighted. And a new impactful program is up and running as a result of Mary Ellen's generous gift. Whether it's an endowment, to me, isn't consequential. How can I answer whether this is an endowment if I don't even know what the word means? I don't know. I don't care. We've got a lot of really happy people, though, as a result of Mary Ellen's gift. The answer to the question of endowments, and this is the one piece that I really want you to take away when you're thinking about endowments and when you're thinking about the conversations with your donors and about how they can support their organization. As long as the donor and the charity agree to the terms of the gift and everyone is happy, then whether you choose to call it an endowment is really up to you. Do not get caught up in the semantics of the word. This is about creating gifts and gift structures where both the donor and the charity are in agreement and happy that they're working together to support the mission of the organization. Again, I don't know if it's an endowment. I don't care if it's an endowment. But there are some real implications for the types of conversations we're having with donors like Mary Ellen. Well, these rules allow for a truly donor-centered approach. We created a gift for Mary Ellen that really reflected exactly what she was trying to do. I would argue that's really donor-centered. And again, anything goes, and with the caveat being that the charity and the donor, this is not all about the donor and it's not all about the charity. The donor and the charity need to agree to the terms of the gift. There are some implications, though, from an investment perspective, from an investment policy perspective. So now we're going to look at some of the governance and policy implications of having some different kinds of gifts and gift structures. Well, first of all, let's talk about investment policies. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I know probably the vast majority of you are probably not deeply embedded in your organization's investments and investment policies, but it's important for you to know and maybe tell your finance people and your volunteers and your investment committee that your investment policies and strategies should be reviewed. And the reason why they should be reviewed is if you have a donor like Mary Ellen, who structured a gift over 10 years, and you have another donor who structured something more permanent and long-term, the investment parameters and the investment mix on a gift that is going to be used over 10 years are very different and should be very different from a gift that is going to be used, say, in perpetuity or over the long term. Investment policies, investment structures reflect in time horizons. And because the time horizons on gifts like Mary Ellen's might be a little bit shorter, your investment policies need to be able to accommodate that. Again, this is probably not something you're deeply involved in your roles as fundraisers, but something that you should definitely be aware of. Let's talk about some of the other implications that I think are probably a little bit more relevant to you. Your gift acceptance policies, and you're probably maybe not involved in the direct structuring of your gift acceptance policies, but you need to know what they are. Your gift acceptance policies may need to be revisited. Most organizations have a gift acceptance policy that addresses what assets you're willing to accept. In other words, will we accept real estate? Will we accept art? Will we accept private company shares? Great. Your gift acceptance policy should definitely address what assets you are willing to accept. But your gift acceptance policy should also address what terms you as an organization are willing to accept. For example, Mary Ellen and her gift, which is used over 10 years, is your organization willing to accept a gift under those terms? Or will it only accept gifts that are used immediately? Or will it only accept gifts where the funds are going to be held permanently or over the long term? So your gift acceptance policy should address not only what assets you're willing to accept, but it should also address what terms you are willing to accept. The trend in the charitable sector, I will tell you, is definitely to have more flexible policies, because if you have a donor that comes to you and says, listen, I have $1 million or 500,000 or $5 million, but I want to use it in this way, my sense is as a charity, you're probably going to want to be, at least at the very least, open to that conversation. That's a lot of money that could be used to support the mission of your organization. So your donor agreements are also probably going to need to be a little bit more flexible. Our donor agreement with Mary Ellen for that 10-year gift may look very different from a donor agreement with some different objectives, including donors that would want their gift to be held over the long term or in perpetuity. Your donor agreements may look different from donor to donor, and that's okay. But you as a charity need to be ready for that your donor agreements may not all look the same. That you may need to have a little bit of flexibility when it comes to how you structure your agreements with your donors. I would argue it's always a good idea to have a formal donor agreement, especially for your larger gifts. Not all charities feel the same way. What about stewardship? Well, I think different donors require different types of stewardship, right? Mary Ellen, she's going to need a lot of upfront stewardship. There's going to be a lot happening with her gift, especially over the course of the first few years as that new program gets off the ground. Do you as an organization have the resources, the people, and the systems, the CRM systems to manage different types of charitable gifts? And if you don't, what might you need to build into your systems in order to manage different types of gifts that you're willing to accept? Because if you have a donor like Mary Ellen who's giving you $3.7 million and you don't steward that gift appropriately, you might not get another one. So those are the issues? So the question is, everything you wanted to know about endowments really always boils down to the question, well, what is an endowment? And the answer is we don't really know exactly what an endowment is. We have these traditional definitions, we have newer definitions, we have hybrid definitions like spend down. None of those definitions matter. None of those definitions matter. What matters, and the only thing I would argue that matters, is that the donor and the charity agree to the terms of the gift, and that gift is being used to support the mission of the organization. So with that, I know we have lots of time that's planned. We have lots of time for questions. I don't know, I turned off my watch. We have lots of time for questions. We're expecting quite a few questions today. I've received some questions in advance of the presentation as well, which I can pose, but I'm hoping that everybody on the call will have a lot of questions. We have a lot of participants today. So fire away, let's talk endowments.
Brad, we have just a couple of questions in the chat function, and one of them was, is there a reason to use the term endowment? For instance, from a marketing perspective, like, is that the kind of notion or idea that people are attracted to?
Yeah, that's a really good
And
question.
I know you're speaking more from a technical perspective, and that's more of a softer marketing perspective, but I think it's an interesting comment.
Yeah, I actually just read, I received kind of a marketing brochure from a charity, a very, very sophisticated marketing brochure, which talked about endowments. And then it talked about, it went on to define what the word meant, and it was very much the permanent definition. Well, I think potentially what that might have the repercussions of that might deter donors who are saying, well, I don't like that notion. I want to leave a gift, but I want to do so under some different terms. I want to have a conversation with this organization, and that might, I would say, potentially deter a donor from having a conversation. So I'm kind of more of the opinion that charities should be marketing to their donors that they're willing to have these conversations, these broad conversations with their donors about how their gift can be used to support the mission of the organization, and try and steer away from traditional terminology like endowments and brochures, because again, I think it ultimately ends up confusing a lot of people. Right.
And there's been some interesting, maybe not necessarily questions, but discussions in the chat about when funds are held, at least, more long-term, if not in perpetuity. What are the issues that are emerging around how those funds are invested? Are you aware of trends around ethical investing or specific areas of investing that charities might want to avoid?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly, like, I don't want to go take us on a tangent that take us too far out of the crux of the conversation. But certainly there are, I think the broader trend, I would say, is, charities will have millions, sometimes tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to invest. And I think the trend is to try and deploy a lot of that capital for good, because how that money is invested can actually help amplify the mission of the organization. And I'm talking specifically about this broader arena called impact investing. And again, we could probably go on a long tangent about impact investing, but impact investing is really essentially trying to create some social good, not only through the grants that you make and through the programs that you run, but also through the investments that you make. So, I can have that conversation with people offline, but definitely there are a lot more impact investing options now than there were, say, even 5 or 10 years ago. It's a really growing trend. You see a lot of private foundations, community foundations have really taken hold of the notion of impact investing. So I'd strongly encourage you to really think as an organization about new ways to invest, and to think about new ideas. Charities are pretty conservative investors as a rule, and I don't think it needs to be that way.
Right. So here's a very specific question. If someone donates $100,000 to reduce their tax bill for that year, but wants to spread the donation over 5 years, do they get a tax receipt for the full $100,000 the year the donation is made?
Yes. So, like, in the case of Mary Ellen, to go back to our example, she would receive, despite the fact that her gift is actually being used by the charity over a longer period of time, she would still receive a donation tax receipt for $3.7 million in the year in which the donation was made. So that's really important. So it doesn't matter when the gift is used by the charity. What matters is when the gift is received by the charity for the purpose of tax receiving.
Perfect. And then a few things in here about the changes coming up to the disbursement quota. Anything you want to say or around that? And in particular, there was a question of what happens to any agreement between the donor and the charity when invested returns don't cover the amount of the disbursement quota. I think that's a pretty hot issue.
Yeah, that is a hot issue, and I think a lot of the devil will come out in the details around the rules to be able to provide donors with some flexibility. But it kind of begs the broader question, which was related. When you have a donor that has an existing agreement, are there opportunities to potentially amend that agreement? And one of the reasons why you might want to amend that agreement is to allow the charity to more easily accommodate meeting its disbursement quota requirements. And if you are looking to amend an existing agreement that you have with the donor, first of all, I strongly would recommend to any organization to get legal advice around it. But the first place that probably any lawyer is going to turn are the terms of the existing agreement. Does that agreement have any provisions for amending it? Can it be easily amended? Who needs to agree to any amendments? Because in the absence of those types of amendment provisions, it is very difficult, without getting into the details, it is very difficult to amend an agreement between a charity and a donor in the absence of amendment provisions in the actual donor agreement. So it's a good question. I don't think the disbursement quota rules are going to have a major impact in terms of how gifts are structured. But you know what they will accomplish is, for some charities, it will allow them to deploy more grants into the organizations that they support. I don't think they have a lot of relevance for our conversation today, but again, I think the key is when you're structuring donor agreements, one of the things that I think all lawyers will tell their donors and their charitable clients is to build a lot of flexibility into those agreements, and also to have provisions that allow those agreements to be amended if necessary.
Right. Yeah, I think there is some concern being expressed about that. So, you know, if a charity is investing funds in a very low risk account, knowing that the DQ was 3.5% and now it's 5%, there's some worry that they may not be able to meet those requirements.
Yeah, I think charities are going to have to rethink their investment strategies. Frankly, I think that thinking that type of thing is long overdue. I think a lot of charities really need to change their approach to how they invest their long-term capital.
Right.
But you know, that again, that's I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deeply.
Right. And so, I mean, this is again another more you know, less technical question rather. So not focusing on the word endowment makes sense, but what do you do with all the donors you have who know the traditional definition of endowment? Do you need to go back and educate them about this change, or what's your advice there in terms of dealing with those donors that you already have in place with long-term funds?
I think it's just helping them understand the continuum, because the old traditional notion of endowment still exists. If a donor and a charity agree that a gift should be accepted under those terms, that's great. I mean, I think it's becoming a little less common for donors to structure their gifts so that they are permanently invested. But I think it's important for donors to be aware that there's more choice, right? So a donor probably who created traditional permanent endowment might not be aware that they could actually structure their gift in a different way. And I think the onus is upon us as fundraisers to make them aware of the variety of ways that donor could potentially support our organization.
Right. And do you would your advice be that charities always consult a lawyer in drafting the terms of these larger or long-term gifts?
I think so. I think it's
Yeah.
certainly to create a base agreement template. Working with a lawyer, I think is always a good idea, because
Right.
I will say this a lot, and I see this all the time, is that charities are using agreements that have a lot of language from 2010 and earlier, and they use terms like enduring property and 10-year gift. Those terms don't even exist anymore in the Income Tax
Right.
Act. They have been repealed. So I think it's really important that all of your donor agreements are up to date. So even having a lawyer review your first couple of donor agreements to make sure that they reflect the current environment, I think is a really important thing to do.
Even in terms of the templates that you have on hand.
Yeah.
But donor agreements are not legally binding, isn't that correct? Just to confirm.
What do you mean?
Well, that's a question here that, someone says, it's my understanding that donor agreements are not legally binding. So, I guess it's not just a matter of legally binding, but whether you want to pursue an agreement if there is something that, is offside with what was in writing.
Yeah, well, I do think donor agreements are legally binding, and they may be there might be a confusion around pledges. A lot of pledges are a little bit more challenging in order to enforce from a legal perspective.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think that distinction's being made in the chat as well.
Yeah, I would argue that a donor agreement is a legally binding document, and that's why it's so important to have the right terminology. And I would argue the most important terminology in any donor agreement is the ability to amend that agreement if necessary. One of the other challenge that's worth mentioning is a lot of charities have these, what they call endowments, and they don't even know how they were created. They don't. They often can't even source out the donor or the donor's family. And for those, again, I think getting legal advice, because you may have some different options around those funds than you might have thought possible. But I think a lot of charities are operating with these funds that they think are restricted and they think are tied up, and that may not necessarily be the case.
Okay. At what point, this is a great question that's just come up, at what point should a white labeled DAF be considered? Is that an option, where there might be a well-known or like a spend down date in mind? Is that something that people might consider?
I'm not sure. Maybe that person can elaborate. I'm just going to go in the chat and read that question, because
I
spent a lot of time working in the at what point should a white label DAF
that's the one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there whether it's a white labeled DAF or any DAF, I think the trend, donor advised funds changed, and I spent a good chunk of my career working in and around donor advised funds, and donor advised funds have changed a lot. And the reason why they changed so much over the course of the past 15 years in terms of how they operate is harkening back to what I mentioned earlier, and that's the disbursement rules being amended in 2010, and that really changed donor advised funds. It provided a different degree of flexibility for donor advised funds. So what you see now with the vast majority of donor advised funds, certainly on the commercial side that are operated through public foundations that are managed by financial institutions, is that they're very flexible. So again, with the DAF, you're not dealing directly with a charity, with an operating charity, but your, of course, DAFs in and of themselves are overseen by charities, by public foundations, but DAFs have a lot of flexibility. So, and that's kind of what we're after here for donors. So we want to give donors flexibility. Donors like flexibility. And one of the reasons why so many donors have gravitated towards donor advised funds is that they provide donors with a certain degree of flexibility. They allow them to support different charities each year with different amounts. They allow them to add. They allow them to it's kind of a one-stop shopping, if you will. So donor advised funds, as a result, have grown down quite significantly in popularity, have grown significantly in popularity as a result of that. But again, it all harkens back to, what does the donor want to do? Does the donor
Right.
want to create a donor advised fund? Does that work for them? Great. If they want to work directly with a charity and set up an agreement and make a gift directly to a charity, then they should do that. And that's all part of being donor centered. So DAFs are great for some donors, but not great for all donors, that's for sure.
Right. So I'm not seeing other questions coming up. I know you said you had a few come into you directly. Anything you want to cover off that hasn't come up yet?
Yeah.
Oh, here's a question. Here's a question that just came in. Sorry to interrupt. Can a donor change the designation of their gift that is set up as an endowment? So once it's set up.
Well, again, I think that the short answer would be, what is the nature of the agreement between the donor and the charity?
Right.
Can that gift be amended, and under what terms can that gift be amended? So the answer is, I think you'll see, especially if you're working with charity, with charity lawyers, and by the way, I always recommend to our clients that when they're choosing a lawyer, that they choose a lawyer who has significant experience working with charities and nonprofits. And many of you know who those lawyers are, and many of them are CAGP members, if not most of them.
Yeah.
So I think it all does depend on what the donor agreement says, but I think most modern donor agreements have a certain layer of flexibility attached to them, and they allow for amendments, provided, of course, the donor and the charity agree to those amendments.
Right. And there's a question about whether there's templates that can be shared, and I think we have some available in Planned Giving for Canadians, the book that is available as part of a CAGP membership. So I think that's a good place to look for something like that. So some questions that came to you directly?
Well, there's a couple, and I do want to address, because this comes up a lot. In fact, it comes up in almost any conversation about quote unquote endowments, and what's the minimum gift amount? Well, again, I think that in answering that question, you need to determine kind of what resources you have a charity, because if you're going to have a donor that's going to structure kind of an unusual gift like Mary Ellen's, let's say Mary Ellen's gift was not $3.7 million. Let's say it was $10,000 or $100,000. Would you, as a charity, agree to accept the gift under those terms? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But I think there's kind of a little bit of what I would call kind of a cost benefit evaluation. You need to know how, there's a lot of work associated with stewarding these gifts. And there's a lot of time and money associated with actually creating a formal agreement with a donor. So I would think donor agreements are really certainly, for gifts of $1 million or more, you probably want to be entering into some kind of agreement with your donors. Some charities would argue it's a lower number of $100,000. But this notion of creating a separate fund where you're going to be reporting back to the donor each year, like Mary Ellen, well, that's work. So you need to determine how much are you willing to, how much work are you willing to put in, and what's the minimum amount you need as a charity in order to make that work worthwhile. So
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So it's really important. So it's not so much what's the minimum for an endowment fund, it's what's the minimum size for a gift with specific terms attached to it.
Right. Yeah.
Because those things will be different from gift to gift.
Yeah, I think that's a very common question, as you've said. So someone's asking about whether a donor agreement can be put in place with a DAF.
Yeah, all DAFs will have donor agreements. So by virtue of setting up a donor advised fund, you will typically be entering into a donor agreement, both when you start the fund and often every time a gift is made to that fund. So DAFs are really rooted in donor agreements, and those donor agreements typically provide a considerable amount of flexibility in terms of how that gift is spent. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that every DAF will have some level of agreement between the charity and the donor.
Fair enough. We're getting close to time, and I feel like this could probably be an entire session unto itself, but someone's asking if you could talk a little bit more about impact investing. Yeah,
I see that question, so the answer is I'm not an expert by any means on impact investing, although I know lots of folks. So what I would do, and I don't know if anybody can do this in the chat box, is like I think Community Foundations Canada, Philanthropic Foundations, in conjunction with Rally Assets, put out a great report on impact investing. I think it's available on all three of those sites. But impact investing is essentially, in a nutshell, creating both an economic return and a social return with your investments. That is the broad definition. The challenge is, like the word endowment, impact investing is open to a lot of interpretation. And I've learned that by talking to a lot of people about impact investing, is that there's not like a formal, this is an impact investment and this is not an impact investment. But generally as a rule, it's this broader notion of an investment having a traditional economic return, which we want all of our investments to have, but also a social return associated with that investment, about how it can amplify the impact of the organization that's making that investment. So there's a lot of great information out there, but I encourage you, if you go to the Rally Assets site, they did that report along with CFC and PFC, and it's a really great summary of the impact investment environment in Canada.
Great. I think that's it, Brad. Was there anything else you wanted to say as final comments, or?
I think it's really what I said earlier, Ruth, is like let's not get bogged down in the semantics of what the word means. Let's just do, as fundraisers, what is right for our donors, and as long as it is aligned with our mission and helping us advance the work that we do, that at the end of the day is the most important thing.
Right. I think that's such an important point, that, you know, it's a sweet spot, right, between the donor's interests, but also making sure the charity's interests are represented as well.
Yeah. And to go back to our original, somebody posed like, what were the answers to the polls, right? Remember those two questions? Some people said yes, some people said no. The answer is I don't know what the answer is. Yes, no, you're both right, you're all right. It's wonderful when you're always right. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure what an endowment is, and the reason why I'm not sure is because the word lacks a definition. So let's just do what's right for our donors and hang on and enjoy the ride.
Exactly. I think you're probably seeing lots of comments in the chat about how excellent this has been and how informative, Brad. So thank you so much. You know, you're just so incredibly knowledgeable about this, and you know, just the way you share the information makes it so, you know, so understanding and interesting. So thank you again so much. To everybody to everyone who's with us today, I'd ask you to please take a moment to answer our short survey. Carolyn's posting the link in the chat right now, and Erin will also include the link in the follow-up email. Your feedback on our webinars is really, really important to us, so do take that into consideration. If there are any other questions for Brad that come up for you after this, he included his coordinates in the last slide of his presentation that you can get in the Dropbox, so please feel free to reach out to Brad directly. I'd like to just let everybody know that registration is open for the next original Canadian gift planning course, which is taking place in beautiful Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. The early bird deadline is December 1st, and registration is open until December 23rd, and that's taking place in February. I'd like you to invite us to join us for our next Webinar Wednesday series on November 30th. It's going to be Jane Riccardelli from Canada Helps and James Emerson with KPMG presenting on cryptocurrency donations, a complex gift, and let's talk risk. And you can register on our website. As always, if you have any questions about Webinar Wednesdays or any other professional development programs we offer, please contact Erin. She's happy to help you out. And as a reminder, all of our education programs, including Webinar Wednesdays, are made possible through the generosity of supporters of the CAGP Foundation, people like you. If you're inspired to support the work we do and strengthen our sector in strategic philanthropy, please consider making a gift. We can be found at CAGPfoundation.org. Once again, thank you so much to Pear Tree Canada for sponsoring the Webinar Wednesday series. And again, Brad, thank you so much for this excellent webinar. It was a pleasure having you. Have a terrific rest of the week, everyone.